Thank you, Madam Chair. I would hope in this House that we have robust debate about ideas, about policies, about bills under consideration. I don't think it's tremendously helpful to call out individual members and put them on the spot. I think that I think that we've heard a lot of name calling. I've heard the word socialist more times in the last 20 minutes than I've heard since my time as an undergrad at the noteworthy left-wing University of Victoria. But you know, I want to say a few things about this budget, about Bill 17. Some debt is okay. Sometimes, some debt is okay. And I think there's a clear argument to be made. You know, the member previous from Strathmore-Brooks referenced the Ralph Klein era. You know, that massive cutback in the 90s led to a substantial underinvestment in infrastructure in this province. And that is something, that's a platform we ran on to borrow responsibly to rebuild infrastructure in this province for the benefits that we will reap from having that infrastructure. And there's a real need to rebuild hospitals and rebuild schools and build new schools and build new health facilities. And you know, it's like a mortgage. I bet you almost everyone in this House, if not themselves personally, then their families, have taken a mortgage at some point. And that is responsible borrowing. It's backed by an asset. That's okay. And I have a real worry that our friends in Wildrose, should the day come, and I hope it doesn't, where they actually form government, will never borrow another penny ever again. And that would, so we now have confirmation from Strathmore-Brooks they would never borrow a penny ever again. So that is a recipe for massive cutbacks to frontline services. There's no other way to do it in a real challenging economic time. And so I don't know what our friends in Wildrose would do. At the very least, we have a budget here which we're going to debate. Now, lest my friends on the other side get too excited, I'm not a big fan of this budget because there is a middle way. There is a better way of dealing with the financial crisis that our province faces right now. Responsible borrowing for capital, that's okay. Borrowing for operations, that's not okay. It is the difference between mortgage debt and credit card debt. Credit card debt racks up over time, and it gets to be out of control. We've already heard that $2 billion a year in a couple of years will be our debt service cost alone. That's a 159% increase. The debt ceiling being eliminated, which is a bill before this House later this morning, is a huge concern. That lasted less than 6 months. And I ask the question again, what if the forecasts are wrong? What if there's a further crisis? What will the terrible forest fires in Fort McMurray and area do to Alberta's budget? We don't know yet. We're still in the crisis mode. And I sincerely hope that we move very quickly into recovery mode, and I sincerely hope that the good people of Fort McMurray can find their way back as soon as possible. But that's going to have a substantial impact on the bottom line of the budget of this government. There's virtually no way, I think, at this point, that we can even expect to hit the deficit number that we're facing. And one of the reasons that you want to have a strong balance sheet, and one of the reasons that you want to make sure that you have some flexibility in your budget, is for unforeseen things like the terrible, terrible situation in Fort McMurray. Now, what's happened there to date is not the fault of this government in the slightest. And in fact, I think this government deserves a lot of praise for the way that you have responded to the forest fires. It is remarkable. I said this in estimates, and I'll say it again here for the House. I think the emergency response that's happened from this government and from the tremendous people in the Alberta Emergency Management Agency, in transportation, in energy, in health, in human services, in education, in every single department of this government that has anything to do with Fort McMurray is nothing short of remarkable. It is a tremendous, I think, something that we should be proud of as Albertans, what has happened. We should be very proud of that. But the challenge that we face when we have a $10 billion deficit is when unforeseen things like a forest fire happen, we have no fiscal flexibility to deal with that. And that puts us even further behind. And that is a real, real concern. And not only is there no plan to get to balance, there's no plan to get to surplus. Because once the money's borrowed, well, it has to be paid back. So we have this vague idea that perhaps maybe in 8 years the budget maybe will balance itself magically, but there's no plan then to get to surplus. There's no plan to actually pay back the money that's been borrowed, and that's a real concern. So there are choices. There are choices this government can make. I'm going to talk about some of those choices. I'm going to talk specifically about what we in the Alberta Party would do to address Alberta's fiscal crisis. And I would challenge every other opposition party to put forward their plans. This is something that I think is very important on the opposition side. It's frankly very easy to poke holes in what the government does. The government has no choice but to put forward legislation, put forward policy. That's your job. And so our job on the opposition side is two things. We oppose, we poke holes and identify areas where you might want to improve or things that we don't like, but there's a second half to that job, which I think is more important, and that's proposing ideas of what we would do differently. That's our job, equally and maybe even more so than simply tearing down what the government does. And in fact, I think it's far more consistent with Alberta values, because in this province, we are builders, we are doers in this province. We talk about what we would do. So what would the Alberta Party Shadow Budget? What would we do? We would balance the budget in 4 years. How would we do that? We would accommodate for population growth, but we would freeze, but not roll back, public sector salaries. I think that's a fair request at a time when the great public servants, and I've talked about the work that's gone on in Fort McMurray, and I think that's a really good indication of the quality of people that we have in this province working in Alberta's public service, and I have a tremendous respect for those people. But when your neighbours are losing their jobs, when your neighbours are being asked to take a 4-day work week and therefore a 20% pay cut, I think it's fair that we ask public sector workers to get paid the same next year as they got paid last year. I think that's fair, because they have a stable, steady job. And that is how we're going to bring costs in line in this province and get Alberta's spending back to at least the national average. I think that's fair. We do that, we don't result in massive public sector layoffs, we don't result in big frontline cuts. But with that wage freeze, I think it's a fair request of our public service. So that does gradually bring our per capita spending back in line with the national average. Now, the other thing we can do is engage in a genuine way with our public servants and ask them how they think we should find cost savings. There is scarcity in Alberta's economy right now. There is massive job loss. We have high unemployment for the first time. Our unemployment is higher than the national average, the first time in 3 decades. There's scarcity out there that's been created by these market forces that are imposing on Alberta. We need to engage people in the public service to find ways of doing more with less. That's what every other company, every household is doing around this province, is finding ways of getting more out of what they already have. And the only area I don't see that happening in any meaningful way is the Alberta government. There is a way to engage those great people in the public service and ask them to do more with less. Think of innovative ways of streamlining processes. It's not just about moving a piece of paper from point A to point B. It's about an outcome for Albertans. It's about good service for Albertans, and there's great people in there. What we need is real leadership from our provincial government to make that happen. We agree with the small business tax cut of 2%. We agree with the idea of an investor tax credit, but it needs to be a broad-based investor tax credit. I asked earlier this week exactly how that investor tax credit will be rolled out, and I can tell you there's a lot of concern that the tax credit is going to be over-narrow, that it will result in the government picking winners and losers. So I think it's very important, and I really do encourage the Minister of Economic Development and Trade to consult widely and to listen to those business owners and really allow that to be as broad a tax credit as possible. Don't make the mistake that others have made previous. Ensure that we don't borrow for operational spending. Make that our hard and fast limit. If you want to legislate something, legislate that. And the carbon tax. I'm in favour of a carbon tax. Done properly, I think a carbon tax can help Alberta not only reduce our emissions, but create a frame where in this province we can innovate. Alberta companies, Alberta entrepreneurs will develop technologies that we can sell to the rest of the world. That will not only reduce Alberta's carbon emissions and find that elusive social license we talk so much about in this House, that the world will see that Alberta is in fact a very responsible energy producer already, and we're only getting better by reducing carbon per barrel, but we'll create technologies the world wants. and that will help diversify our economy by pivoting off of what we already do very well in this province. If the carbon tax is done right, then we will achieve that goal. But if we have massive rebates to almost 2/3 of the province, I'm not sure that, in fact, that's done properly. So that remains to be seen. I imagine we will be debating that carbon tax even further in this province, or in this House, and so we'll see exactly how it's done. The principle of a carbon tax I support. The implementation, the way it works, is an open question. So this budget makes me worried for the future of our province. Not worried for the future of our province in terms of the total viability. I'm pretty sure that the sun is going to come up tomorrow once this budget is passed. But it puts us on the wrong path. And we need to find a middle way, a better way than massive frontline service cuts, and a better way than massive unsustainable deficits. There is a middle ground. And unfortunately, I haven't heard, aside from this end of the House, any of that tone in this debate. And so with that, Madam Chair, I thank you very much for the time.